The grand estate in Napa Valley was bathed in a golden glow, the late afternoon sun painting the vineyard in shades of amber. Inside the main hall, the atmosphere was alive with hushed whispers, the rustling of silk dresses, and the quiet shifting of guests eager for the ceremony to begin. Edward Blake stood near the altar, his tailored black tuxedo exuding effortless sophistication. But the restless tapping of his polished shoe against the marble floor betrayed his unease. "Where is she?" Edward muttered under his breath, glancing at his watch for the third time in as many minutes. His voice barely reached the bride, who stood beside him in an exquisite lace gown that shimmered in the warm light pouring through the arched windows. Her poised demeanor faltered slightly as she leaned closer to him. "Her car broke down," the bride whispered, her tone apologetic yet calm. "She called. She's on her way. Just a little longer." Edward ran a hand through his neatly styled hair, a sharp contrast to the composure he usually exuded in boardrooms. "This isn't a board meeting where we can stall, you know. It's a wedding. People expect things to run on time." "She'll make it," the bride reassured him, though her tightly clenched bouquet hinted at her nerves. Before Edward could retort, a loud creak interrupted the soft hum of whispers. All heads turned toward the double doors at the end of the aisle, which swung open to reveal a woman framed by the fading sunlight. Lila Bennett stood in the doorway, breathless and radiant despite her disheveled state. Her floor-length dress was slightly wrinkled, the hem damp, and marked with evidence of her hurried journey. One glittering silver heel was scuffed, and the other appeared mismatched. Sorry," Lila murmured as she quickly stepped into the hall, her cheeks flushed from exertion. She clutched a bouquet in one hand and held the train of her dress in the other, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her face, some strands escaping what had once been an elegant updo. Despite her rushed appearance, there was an undeniable elegance about her, a quiet confidence that seemed to settle the room. Edward's initial irritation evaporated as his eyes locked on her. He watched intently as she made her way down the aisle, mouthing an apology to the bride, who offered her an understanding nod. Edward, however, couldn't take his eyes off her. "Glad you could join us," he murmured dryly as she reached the altar, his tone hovering between sarcasm and amusement. Lila glanced at him briefly, her hazel eyes meeting his with a mix of embarrassment and quiet defiance. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. As the ceremony resumed, Edward found himself distracted. The officiant's voice became background noise as he stole glances at Lila. Her frazzled entrance had given way to a composed grace that seemed to command his attention effortlessly. Who was she? Edward wondered silently, his curiosity growing with every passing moment. The sun dipped lower over the sprawling vineyard, casting the reception in a warm amber glow. The air buzzed with the laughter of guests, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the subtle hum of a live jazz band. Edward Blake, however, remained a quiet observer. Standing by the bar, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, his sharp eyes scanned the crowd. It didn't take long for his gaze to find her. Lila stood at the edge of the dance floor, laughing with another bridesmaid. Her dark hair was no longer as meticulously styled as it had been during the ceremony, but the loosened waves framed her face beautifully. Her laugh, light and melodic, carried over the music, striking a chord in Edward that he couldn't quite place. Setting his glass down with purpose, Edward straightened his suit jacket and strode toward her. The confidence he carried in every deal and negotiation was now aimed at one target, the enigmatic woman who had captured his thoughts since the moment she entered the hall. Lila's laugh faded as she noticed him approaching. Her hazel eyes, filled with a mix of surprise and curiosity, met his. "You certainly know how to make an entrance," Edward said smoothly, a teasing grin tugging at the corner of his lips. Lila's lips quirked into a nervous smile. "Not my best moment," she admitted, "but at least I made it in time." "Barely," Edward quipped, his grin widening. "The bride seemed ready to send out a search party." Lila chuckled softly, her shoulders relaxing. "She wouldn't have been wrong. I had a bit of an adventure on the way here." Edward tilted his head, his interest piqued. Adventure? Sounds like there's a story behind that. Lila hesitated, glancing down at the slightly scuffed hem of her dress. It's not that interesting, she replied. Flat tire, running in heels, the usual. The usual? Edward repeated, his tone incredulous. You must live a far more exciting life than I do. Lila laughed again, the sound infectious. For a moment, Edward forgot the world around him, focused entirely on the woman standing before him. Before she could respond, the band shifted to a slower tune, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Edward extended his hand, his grin playful yet insistent. How about you tell me the rest of that story over a dance? Lila hesitated, her gaze darting toward the dance floor and back to Edward's outstretched hand. I'm not much of a dancer, she admitted. Edward raised an eyebrow, undeterred. Neither am I. We'll make quite the pair. Lila rolled her eyes but placed her hand in his. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Edward led her onto the dance floor, his touch steady and sure. They moved slowly, Lila's initial awkwardness melting away under Edward's easy confidence. See, Edward said softly, his smirk returning, you're not half bad at this. You're not so bad yourself, Lila retorted, a small smile playing on her lips. I'm guessing you've done this before? Once or twice, Edward admitted, but I don't think I've ever had such captivating company. Lila looked away, her cheeks warming. You're good at this, she said after a moment. Abbing? No, she met his gaze, her hazel eyes softening. At making people feel comfortable, even when they're completely out of their element. Edward's playful smirk gave way to a more genuine smile. It helps when the company's worth it. Their conversation flowed as naturally as their movements. Edward found himself captivated by Lila's sharp wit and unassuming charm, while Lila, against her better judgment, began to feel at ease in his presence. As the song ended, Edward reluctantly escorted her off the dance floor. They lingered at the edge of the crowd, neither seeming eager to part ways. So Lila, Edward began, his tone casual but laced with curiosity, what do you do when you're not saving weddings with your dramatic entrances? Lila's smile faltered slightly, her gaze dropping. I work at an art gallery, she said after a brief pause. Mostly behind the scenes. Edward's interest deepened. An art gallery? That sounds fascinating. Which one? It's small, Lila replied quickly, her tone evasive. Not the kind of place that gets a lot of attention. Edward arched an eyebrow at her vague answer, but chose not to press further. Maybe I'll stop by sometime, he offered lightly. Maybe, Lila said with a polite smile, though her tone held a note of finality. Before Edward could say more, a photographer moved through the crowd, his camera aimed toward the dance floor. Lila tensed visibly, turning her head away from the lens. Everything okay? Edward asked, noticing the sudden shift in her demeanor. I just don't like having my picture taken, Lila replied quickly, her voice tight. Edward nodded, though her reaction left him puzzled. Fair enough. No photos then. A moment later, Lila glanced at her watch and sighed softly. I should go, she said, her tone reluctant. Already? Edward asked, disappointment flickering across his face. It's getting late, Lila replied, her voice quiet. And I have an early morning tomorrow. Let me walk you out, Edward offered. Lila hesitated but eventually nodded. All right. As they walked toward the parking area, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Lila was holding something back. Her easy laugh and quick wit hinted at a complexity that intrigued him. Yet her reluctance to share personal details painted the picture of someone carefully guarding her secrets. When they reached her car, a modest sedan with a slightly dented bumper, Lila turned to face him. Thanks for the dance, Edward, she said warmly. Thanks for letting me drag you onto the floor, Edward replied with a grin. But I have a feeling this won't be the last time I see you. Lila's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. We'll see, she said softly, before slipping into her car. Edward stood there, watching as her tail lights disappeared into the night. His chest tightened with a mix of frustration and intrigue. Whoever Lila Bennett was, Edward wasn't ready to let the mystery end here. The morning after the wedding, Edward Blake sat in his sleek corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a stunning view of downtown. He couldn't shake the image of her from his mind, the way her laugh had filled the air, her sharp wit, the vulnerability she had tried to hide. Who was she, and why did she feel like a puzzle he was desperate to solve? By mid-morning, Edward's curiosity had overtaken him. He picked up his phone and dialed the bride. "Edward?" she chirped on the other end. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I just have a question," he said, trying to sound casual. "Your bridesmaid, Lila, what's her story?" There was a pause, and Edward could almost hear the hesitation in her voice. "Lila's private," the bride said carefully. "She doesn't talk much about her life, especially her family. Let's just say she's been through a lot." Edward frowned, leaning back in his chair. She seemed guarded. "I can't stop thinking about her." The bride chuckled softly. "Well, that's new. Mr. Blake, intrigued by someone other than a business deal?" "Funny," Edward replied dryly. "But seriously, she's different. I'd like to get to know her." "Edward," the bride said gently, "if anyone can break through, it's you. Just be gentle. Lila's not like the women you're used to." At the gallery, Edward found Lila sorting through frames, her casual appearance just as captivating. Though surprised by his visit, Lila reluctantly agreed to join him for coffee. Over tea, Lila shared her passion for art, admitting she used to paint, but stopped when life became complicated. Edward encouraged her to prioritize what matters. Their conversation filled with laughter and shared stories. However, when Lila received a text, her mood shifted, and she abruptly ended their meeting, claiming she needed to return to work. "Some mysteries are better left unsolved," she said, her voice barely audible as she turned away. "But maybe not this one." As Edward watched her leave, he resolved to uncover the truth behind her guarded demeanor and the secrets she was hiding. Edward's curiosity about Lila deepened after their meeting. Through his connections, he uncovered her secret. Lila was the daughter of Henry Bennett, a disgraced financier whose scandal destroyed their family's reputation. Edward confronted Lila at the gallery, gently revealing what he had learned. At first defensive, Lila eventually opened up. She described the fallout of her father's actions, losing friends, family, and her identity. She shared how she had spent years trying to escape the shadow of her past, rebuilding her life in anonymity. Edward assured her that her past didn't matter to him. He admired her resilience and the strength it took to start over. Though touched by his words, Lila remained cautious, fearing her past could ruin his life as well. Their conversation was interrupted when a photographer snapped a picture of them. The next day, tabloids painted Lila as a manipulative social climber, using Edward to regain status. The scandal put pressure on Edward's business, with his partners demanding he distance himself from her. Fearing she was bringing Edward down, Lila made a painful decision. She left the city, retreating to her hometown to escape the chaos and protect him from further damage. Edward felt the weight of Lila's absence more acutely than he expected. Days turned into weeks, yet he couldn't shake the image of her walking away. His days, usually filled with sharp focus and efficiency, felt dull and incomplete. The tabloids had quieted, their attention shifting to new scandals. But the damage to his heart remained. One evening, Edward met the bride, who had always been close to Lila. "I need your help," he admitted, his tone filled with both determination and vulnerability. The bride smiled knowingly. "I was wondering when you'd come to me." "Do you know where she is?" Edward asked, hope flickering in his voice. "She mentioned going back to her hometown," the bride revealed. "There's an art studio there where she used to spend a lot of time. If she's anywhere, it's probably there." Edward drove through the quiet streets of Lila's small hometown, far removed from the bustling city life he was used to. The town had an unassuming charm, with modest storefronts and tree-lined roads. He found the studio easily, a weathered building with large windows that let in the golden afternoon light. Through the glass, Edward saw her. Lila was seated at an easel, her back to him, the tip of her brush moving deliberately across the canvas. Her posture was relaxed, yet focused, and for a moment, Edward simply watched her. She seemed at peace in this small, quiet world, yet there was a lingering sadness in her movements. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Lila turned at the sound, her eyes widening in shock. "Edward," she said, standing quickly, "what are you doing here?" "I came to bring you back," Edward said simply, his voice calm but firm. Lila frowned, her arms crossing defensively. "I told you, this isn't going to work." Edward closed the distance between them. "You're wrong, Lila. It already works. It works because I don't care about your past, your name, or what anyone else thinks. I care about you." Lila's expression faltered. "Edward, you don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You've built this perfect life, this perfect reputation. If I stay, I'll ruin that for you." "Don't you see?" Edward replied, his voice softer now. "None of that matters to me if you're not part of it." Lila hesitated, her gaze dropping. "You don't know what it's like," she said quietly. "To be judged for something you didn't do. To have your name define you, no matter how hard you try to escape it." Edward reached out, gently taking her hand. "Then let me help you redefine it. Lila, you're not your father's mistakes. You're strong, talented, and worth fighting for. And I'm not giving up on you." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as his words sank in. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. But just as quickly as that hope surfaced, doubt crept in. "I've spent so long running," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Every time I think I've stopped, the past finds me again." Edward took a step closer, his gaze steady. "Then let me catch you and stand beside you no matter what comes." A tear rolled down Lila's cheek, and she let out a shaky laugh. "You're infuriating, you know that?" "I've been told," Edward replied, his grin widening. For a moment, the weight of her past didn't seem so heavy. Lila took a deep breath, squeezing Edward's hand. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." Edward's smile grew warmer, his relief palpable. "That's all I need." Edward stayed with Lila for the afternoon, watching her paint as they talked. For the first time in years, Lila felt a sense of peace, not because her problems had disappeared, but because she finally had someone willing to stand beside her through them. Though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Edward wasn't just part of her life anymore, he was part of her strength.